I have felt for a long time that they have been using the markets as a means to unwind their very large dollar and treasury position. I think the bottom line is when we look at the Chinese, they look at things in a whole different time frame than we do here in the United States, and I think they're looking at an end game where the object is to acquire the world's commodities on the cheap. Ultimately, what they're trying to do in striking unilateral trade arrangements, usurping the dollar and accumulating all of the world's commodities on the cheap is certainly, ultimately, someday they'd like to challenge the world reserve. Quite frankly, I don't think the Trump administration has a shot in the dark of changing anything anything substantive. I really don't.
Sign up for the Superhuman Brain Free Masterclass. 99% of the population is focused on treating the symptoms of brain-based diseases and disorders. Remarkably, the 1% who focus on cultivating a healthy, high-performing brain often see symptoms disappear as a side effect of getting healthy and restoring function. The Superhuman Brain Masterclass will give you access to the upgrades you've been looking for, maximize memory, exceptional focus, and greatly productive brain function. When you join this free masterclass, you'll learn the Superhuman Brain proprietary methodology, a world-class education with simple checklists, step-by-step solutions, and little-known protocols that invite healing, brain upgrades, and next-level performance. The Superhuman Brain Masterclass is online and free from December 3rd through the 9th, 2018. Sign up with the link below. Welcome to Business Game Changers. I'm Sarah Westall. Today's show, I have Andy Schectman coming. He is the president of Miles Franklin. They are one of the largest gold and silver and precious metals dealer, and they have the best reputation, which is what I love. They don't have problems with customers. They don't have all these scandals going on. He's just brilliant. I've had him on a couple times, and I wanted to bring him back to talk about what's really going on in the world. And we're going to talk about China, because China's kind of the elephant in the room as far as long-term, them taking over control of the world power and how they're doing it. They think long-term. We don't think long-term like they do. We need to, but we aren't. And maybe we are now because we're realizing at this last moment when we need to do a dollar reset that, hey, we should have been thinking long term. And maybe people are starting to think that way. And we analyze that. What's really going on? What are JP Morgan and some of these other companies doing, especially JP Morgan and their silver position? He talks about that. It's a really great conversation. And then he stays after and he talks to my patrons for a bit about how to buy silver, what to look for and why it's important. Great information. That's for my patrons. I have a link below. So let's get into my interview now with Andy Schectman. Andy, thank you so much for coming back to the program. It's such an honor.
That's awesome to be here, Sarah. It's been too long. Thanks for having me back.
I want to talk about gold and silver, but I first want to talk about China because, the administration's rhetoric around China has really increased, and people are talking that China has been planning for a long time to take over control of the world, or try to. And they look like they're in sight for that. What do you know about China and what they're doing to prepare economically for a change in, power shift?
China is very tight-lipped, Sarah, on most of their financial doings. They don't really tell the world what they're up to, and in fact, they've only updated their gold reserves maybe twice in the last decade, when it's very, very well known that they have been probably the largest accumulators of gold in the world and the largest producers of gold in the world. And so, they are looking, I believe, in terms of decades. When people in the West look in terms of days and weeks, they are certainly preparing. I have felt for a long time that they have been using the markets as a means to unwind their very large dollar and treasury position. They use the precious metals market. I think if you can envision let's just call it a very, very large Chinese businessman with two very big pockets. On one pocket, he's sitting with a couple trillion in US dollars, and in the other pocket, a couple trillion in US treasuries. And if they were to just simply dump dollars and sell treasuries in an effort to reposition themselves into other currencies or other commodities, it would be self-defeating. They'd cut off their nose to spite their face. But what if they were involved over the last several years in suppressing the price of metals with their right pocket filled with dollars? Follow me on this for a minute. They empty out their right pocket of dollars to suppress all of the world's commodities that they want to acquire, and they suppress them on the futures market with a tremendous amount of leverage. I'll give you an example. You can buy or sell a 100-ounce gold contract, which controls 130,000 in gold, for about $3,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. So the leverage of 30 to 1 or 40 to 1 leverage is fantastic. And so imagine, if you will, that they reach into their right pocket and they take a whole bunch of dollars and they short every commodity on the planet, from copper to fossil fuels to precious metals. They do that because they want to acquire them at subsidized prices. And the way that technical analysis works, which pretty much guides the whole financial universe, is how do things look technically? Are the prices violating 50 and 200-day moving averages? Are they violating technical indicators? And if the people that are pushing down the prices have enough power and wherewithal and deep enough pockets to drive these prices down, all of a sudden it's a whole new perception of reality. So anyways, they reach into their pocket, they suppress all the prices. In particular, precious metals. They suppress the price of gold. They suppress the price of silver. The same time, when you sell something short, you get money back. It's kind of like you sell something short, you get money, you have the obligation to pay it back. So they sell short across the board with the money in their right pocket, lessening the stockpile of dollars that they have and putting it to good use. You'll see where I'm going in a minute. Anyways, they suppress the prices of the metals. They take the proceeds and they go around the world and they buy up as much as they can in terms of physicals at subsidized prices when no one's really looking at precious metals because the technicals look horrible. So now they've pushed down the price, although they do have an obligation to pay it back. We'll get to that in a minute. With the proceeds of the shorted commodity investments that they're making, they buy up all of the physicals. They buy up stockpiles of copper and aluminum and gold and silver and platinum. They're buying up as much of the fossil fuels as they can in future production of oil across the globe at subsidized prices. Now, so they've got all of these physicals that they were able to acquire by shorting the physical markets. And I think it's very plain to see that they're involved in shorting the commodities if you look close enough. But suffice it to say, they still have two problems in this scenario. They have their left pocket filled with treasuries, and they have these short positions that they need to close out. So what if slowly over time they start taking treasuries out of their left pocket? We know that they haven't been acquiring them, and we know that they've actually been slowly selling them. What if they slowly sell the treasuries to cover their short positions in all of the commodities that they've shorted across the globe in order to acquire them on the cheap? So now they slowly sell their treasuries. They cover all of their short positions, which will levy the price in due time when they want it to, because quite frankly, I think they're very happy to see these low prices on all of the world's commodities. It gives them the ability to acquire them at pennies on the dollar without any competition. But when it's all said and done, they will have emptied out their right pocket of dollars to control the prices, and then they will have emptied out their left pocket of treasuries to cover their shorts, which will only levy the value of what it is that they acquired on the cheap and will provide value for their dollars and for their treasuries. If both of those pockets were emptied too soon, you cut off your nose to spite your face. The dollar tumbles, interest rates spike, and they would be crowded out of the positions that they're trying to acquire. I think the bottom line is when we look at the Chinese, they look at things in a whole different time frame than we do here in the United States, and I think they're looking at an end game where the object is to acquire the world's commodities on the cheap. We live in a world where information travels so quickly that if they were just to openly go in and start acquiring things, accumulating things openly, it would very, very quickly, they would be crowded out of their trade. And you can also see the way that their currency has more or less paralleled the price of gold for the past 6, 8 months. I think what they're trying to say there, if you look at the value of the yuan and gold, the symmetry is ridiculous. It's almost completely symmetrical. And I think they're behind that too. Kind of what they're trying to tell the world is that our yuan is as good as gold. And I think ultimately what they're trying to do in striking unilateral trade arrangements, usurping the dollar and accumulating all of the world's commodities on the cheap is certainly, ultimately, someday they'd like to challenge the world reserve. Don't know when that will be, but I think it's on the table.
Did you know that gluten is the one protein that humans cannot digest? And it's everywhere. Almost all restaurant foods, salad dressings, and so much more have gluten. To make matters worse, gluten is known to be one of the worst culprits for creating inflammation in the body. Chronic sustained inflammation causes joint pain, headaches, skin issues, digestive problems, weight gain, brain fog, and lowered immunity. The good news is there is an enzyme complex which specifically breaks down gluten, DDP4. Learn how to use this enzyme to eat the food that you want, protect yourself against inflammation, and become a healthier you. Click the link below.
And you don't know when that's going to be, but we're talking not that far in the future. I mean, we're talking maybe a decade out because, according to MIT, the dollar is going to die on itself by 2031, something like that, just because of the inflation value makes the dollar go down to almost nothing. And by 2031, I think that's what they said, just when they were looking at the mathematical, information, that's when it just ends. You can't go any farther. It goes down to zero.
One of my favorite, statistics or numbers is 1 trillion seconds ago. We have a $22 trillion debt and $150 trillion in unfunded liabilities and things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, government, military pensions, and the like. And people, when I was growing up, $1 million seemed so far away and so hard to obtain. And there are a lot of people now who would tell you $1 million really isn't what it used to be. So 1 trillion must not be either. But Sarah, when you stop and think how big 1 trillion is, 1 trillion seconds ago was 31,688 years ago. That's 1 trillion seconds. The numbers have become so big and so unsustainable. And with interest rates on the rise, that becomes much more frightening and unsustainable. So yeah, absolutely. The dollar ultimately has to die under its own weight. And that's kind of the mantra of the Federal Reserve. I think it's either inflate or die. There really is no way out of it. I think we're past the point of being able to pay off the debt with any ease. We'll put it that way.
Well, it's kind of we're in a position inflate or die, or inflate to die. I mean,
Well, some people would tell you that is the ultimate goal, is to inflate to reset and
yes.
Squeeze as much as you can out of the dollar and as much as you can out of this enormous mountain of debt that we have before we have to just reset. And so there are a lot of people who would say that is the ultimate end game.
Well, yeah. They have to do something, and hopefully they can manage it carefully. But now going back to China, just for self-preservation, almost has to do some of these things, right? Because they know that the dollar is in its situation that it's in.
Absolutely. And that's why they are in no rush to see this happen. And that's why they are using their ability to control and manipulate a lot of the commodity markets so that they can quietly exit the dollar arena, both physical dollars and treasuries, with some value before it plummets, and using that value to accumulate real things. And in the end, that's really what matters. It's not how many dollars you own, it's how many ounces of gold do you own, how many barrels of oil do you own, how much copper do you own. You can see the way they're building their infrastructure with these ghost cities that no one lives in. They're using the dollars that we have given them by buying their stuff over the past 50 years to build their infrastructure, their real infrastructure, and to build their stockpile of real assets.
So, I mean, we're in a real situation. I mean, it's like game time, right? I mean, everybody's trying to figure out how we can reset the dollar and still maintain power. Everybody's trying to figure out, get ahead of how this reset's going to happen, maintain our positions and our wealth. Do you think, based on actions, because nobody's ever really forthright, they'll make comments to give hints and clues, and especially the people in the inside that know, based on actions and some of those things, what do you think the Trump administration is doing to deal with this stuff?
Well, they're getting real with China in terms of these trade wars that you're beginning to see. They are. Look, I don't know if the Trump administration really can do anything, to be honest with you. I think it might be too far past the ability to do things. But I think you can try. You can try and strengthen the dollar. You can try and fight back against what he views as inequality in terms of business practices. But in the end, I think that the Trump administration is not going to be able to change anything whatsoever. The numbers are too big, and the problems are too long in the tooth. So I don't know, Sarah. I don't know what the end game is. Maybe the end game is to revalue the price of gold and silver. The 8,000 plus tons that we supposedly have at Fort Knox. If we were to revalue it north of $5,000, $10,000, and a lot of people talk about that as an ability to have our currency backed by gold and value high enough to where it wouldn't hamper the ability to transact world trade. But quite frankly, I don't think the Trump administration has a shot in the dark of changing anything anything substantive. I really don't.
Well, I kind of think that part of his, nation first, nationalism, which scares people. It doesn't scare me, knowing that there's going to be a reset and everybody's trying to take over. I think that's what you have to think about, getting our money back that's been stolen, the black market, doing things like what you're saying, revaluing the gold, and then starting to print our own money and slough ourselves with this Federal Reserve. We could get into at least a solid ground. We might not be the most powerful in the world anymore, but we sure would have a solid ground so that at least our people won't starve and be in a terrible.
Anything that we do to rectify the situation is going to require an awful lot of pain, and it's not going to be something that's met with fanfare in the United States public. And quite frankly, when you have demographics the way that you do, where 50% of the country doesn't pay any taxes and so much goes to entitlements. And let me put it this way. Can you imagine if you woke up one morning to find no food stamps and the entitlement program stopped in an effort to strengthen the dollar, to shorten our debt burden. And, so much of the debt is owed to the American people, and so much of it comes through entitlement programs. But the hard decisions, the difficult decisions, I think will be almost impossible to do, at least in terms of the way that these decisions are met with the public. So I don't know that, building up the infrastructure, bringing home our troops, closing out unfair trade practices. These are all great ideas. And if the people were able to withstand the pain that would cause, maybe the greatest depression of all time, asset prices tumbling, soup lines, if we could go through that and cleanse the system, then maybe that's how you do it. But I wonder if this country is able to embrace that kind of change. And I think you can see that Trump hasn't really been a very popular president with the public because of these difficult choices. There are some people on our side of the table who may applaud him and see the good in what he's doing, but most of the people, I think, in the country don't see that. In fact, they look at it with disdain. And if you see the hard decisions made, where you start to challenge the Federal Reserve and you start to really make it tough at home economically, financially, those kind of decisions very quickly get thrown out. And I don't know what the end game is. I have a feeling we're too far down the rabbit hole, Sarah, but certainly I applaud Trump for his efforts and wish him very well and hope he succeeds. Little by little, you have to chip away or you just give up, I guess.
Well, what's the alternative? Because, I mean, I look at these people that still want to grow the entitlements and they still want to do all these things and not get real about what's going on in our country. Is it on purpose or just complete sheer ignorance? Or both?
Well, again, I guess it's a little bit of both, and we've created a monster that's too hard to just stop. in a couple of years, 2025 or so, 100% of all the government revenue will go to entitlements and paying interest on the debt. That doesn't take into account things like the military or fixing the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the police, the National Guard, all of these things that run our country in a matter of a decade or less. We're going to have to be borrowing just to pay off the interest on the debt and just to pay off our entitlements and let alone doing the things that need to be done to fix things. So, I think that's the bottom line is we have to make these very, very difficult decisions. And I don't know if we're in a position to do that.
Well, what do you think about cryptocurrencies and the cryptocurrency market? Is that going to, at what point is that going to take over? And is it going to take over? And, what do you see with that?
Well, I think maybe FedCoin is certainly something that they would try to, I don't think the Federal Reserve or the U.S. government will ever truly relinquish control of money, and or at least they'll do all they can to not. And, you can see the enthusiasm that Bitcoin took with it in 2017. It's been a little bit quieted here, muted in 2018. The cryptos really aren't doing what many thought they would do right now. But, I think that it speaks to a larger problem, and that is people realize innately, whether they can articulate it or not, that there's problems with the dollar, and they're looking for alternatives. I just have a hard time believing that the Federal Reserve and the powers that be will allow a truly decentralized currency that is free from any governmental jurisdiction or governmental intervention. And so the cryptocurrencies are a neat idea, but I just don't see the adoption. What really will make a currency valuable is mass adoption. And, I don't even know too many people at all in outside of my business that own any cryptocurrency would even know how to buy it or where to buy it. And so if anything, I think you see a Fed coin and Fed come and try to issue a cryptocurrency and let that pass. But yeah, of course, they would certainly love that more than anything. Now you can control and see everything that's ever spent. And, you lose the anonymity associated with currency. So I'm not a big crypto guy. I think you can probably tell, although I respect what it stands for. I think we're a long ways away before we see that take over as money.
Well, what do we have to prepare for? What do you think the U.S. is staring? Because you're seeing a pretty dire situation coming up. What are we going to see? I mean, is it going to be like the 1930s depression or worse, where there's soup lines and people are starving on the streets? I mean, are we going to lose 50 million people to starvation, or are we going to be okay? I mean, do we have the resources to get through? I mean, what are you seeing?
Well, that's a good question. Some people will tell you you'll see hyperinflation before you see soup lines in a Great Depression. Other people, like Harry Dent, will tell you we're already well on our way to the Greatest Depression. I think when we talk about what you can do to protect yourself, I try to be objective. And yes, we sell precious metals, but if you look at what gold can do for you in an inflation or in a deflation, it's proven that in a deflation, now most people associate gold with inflation, that it protects your purchasing power as that inflation that's already in the system in places like college tuition, in places like insurance, in all of the equity markets, in places that we haven't seen yet, hasn't spilled over into the real economy. But people are always talking about gold protecting you in a hyperinflation. But it's also been proven that gold probably is the finest asset to own in a mass deflation, if that's what we see, because it's basically one of the only assets in the world that isn't simultaneously someone else's liability. So I don't know what we're going to see, Sarah. I mean, you could argue deflation is certainly probably the end game after perhaps a massive inflationary influx as dollars are dumped and interest rates rise. Ultimately, if that's what we were to see, a huge inflationary effect followed by a deflationary a long, prolonged deflationary, maybe depressionary environment. These are all real endgame possibilities when you look at the mountain of debt that we've created and at the lowest interest rates in the history of the Federal Reserve. So what happens when interest rates rise? What happens when there's an alternative to the dollar? What happens if Saudi Arabia strikes unilateral deals with other countries to sell oil and the petrodollar status is absolved? If you see these things happen, you'll see a very, very quick unwinding of the way of life here in the United States. And I don't know if it'll be mass deflation first or after. I think deflation is definitely in the cards, but first you'll see, I think, a big inflationary problem as dollars ultimately get dumped. And I think that's what you protect yourself against is more than anything is a crumbling of the U.S. dollar. Ultimately, I think that's the end game, protecting yourself against the dollar, whether it's inflation or deflation. Both are possibilities. Both have logical arguments. Precious metals will protect you in both environments. And I think it's important, especially at these prices, to accumulate it. And when I'm looking right now at the positioning of the most sophisticated traders on the globe, the commercial banks, you see something very illuminating that makes me feel this way, Sarah. And I think they see that as well. For the first time in that I can remember, and only the third time in the last 45 years, the commercial banks are going long on the futures market. The same time, you see a company like JP Morgan, who I would call the most sophisticated traders on the globe, most influential, well-funded, well-informed. They have amassed 800 million ounces of physical silver in their house account. That's the largest position the world has ever seen at one time. It's 8 times what the Hunt brothers tried to acquire in 1980, along with many, many tens of thousands of ounces of gold. Right now, they're sitting on over $50 billion in physical metal in their account. The interesting thing about that is that they've been short on paper for the past decade, since they inherited Bear Stearns' short position in 2008. And during that time, as they have been short since 2008, they have never had a losing trade, not one in their short book, which is almost a mathematic impossibility. And all of the trades that they've put on since 2008, every single one of them has been profitable. Not one hasn't been. And I would argue they don't need to acquire physical metal to make untold gazillions of dollars just manipulating the paper price. Perhaps over the last 3 years, as they've accumulated this tremendous stockpile of physical, perhaps they've been using this suppressed, manipulated paper price to accumulate the largest supply of physicals the world has ever seen. Maybe they see what's coming and they're positioning themselves outside of just paper investments and actually accumulating mammoth positions of physical. And that to me is something that I look as a kind of foreshadowing of where we think things are going when you see the most sophisticated traders on the globe taking that big of a position in physicals, which is very strange, and going long the futures market for only the third time in the last 5 decades. To me, it's encouraging, to say the least.
Well, they're doing what China's doing, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're aligned with China. Yeah. So silver is the most unique situation because it's so undervalued historically. Can you talk about that? I mean, people think that not only is it undervalued historically, but silver has a manufacturing high-tech ability that's going to cause it to maybe even bypass gold. Now, do you think any of that stuff, and what do you think about silver?
Well, the geological relationship between gold and silver is 15.5 to 1, meaning there's 15.5 times more silver geologically than there is gold in the Earth's crust. And that's probably why we see the 16 to 1 ratio that goes back thousands of years. Over the last 5 decades, the average ratio of gold to silver, meaning how many ounces of silver it takes to buy an ounce of gold, has been roughly 43, 44 to 1. Call it 45 to 1. 45 ounces of silver buys 1 ounce of gold going back 50 plus years. In the last, well, right now we're at about 85 to 1. And there's been one time in the last 50 years, 1993, a brief moment in 1993, where you could get more silver by trading your gold. In other words, the ratio of gold to silver is as out of whack as it's been in the last 50 years, but for one brief moment in 1993. What we're advising people to do, because this is so far out of whack, is to trade gold for silver right now at an 85-to-1 ratio with the expectation of swapping back into gold. When that ratio falls back to its 50-year average of roughly 45-to-1, when that happens, you double the amount of gold that you get. But the thing is this with silver, 5,000 years worth of history, Sarah, tell us that silver is not as rare as gold. In fact, it's 15.5 times less rare than gold. However, over the last 70 years, and it's hard to turn 5,000 years worth of history upside down and realize maybe that we're not right anymore, because over the last 70 years or so, anything that conducts electricity has silver in it, anything. And whether it be the first hair dryer you ever used when you were a little girl, or the first refrigerator you opened up, or the black and white TV you used way back when, or the simple light switch that you turned on somewhere down the road. So many of these things that we've used, all the iPhones and the first cell phones and the calculators and everything, all has a modicum of silver in it. Most of that stuff is in landfills, never to be recaptured. So much of the silver that's been used in industry, and it is an integral part of industry, not just industry, warfare. 500 ounces of silver goes in the tip of every Tomahawk cruise missile. But all that silver that's been used in industry, so much of it is gone forever, never to be recaptured or reclaimed, whereas about 80 to 90% of all the gold ever mined since Genesis is still here. And it makes sense to pull a fifth of an ounce of gold out of a motherboard of something, but it doesn't make sense to pull a fifth or eighth or a tenth of an ounce of silver out of a motherboard. And so all that stuff is in a landfill, gone forever. And so there are a lot of people who will tell you that while geologically silver certainly is less rare than gold, the above ground stockpiles of silver perhaps now are actually more scarce than the above ground stockpiles of gold. And because it is so integral in industry and in warfare, perhaps, maybe that's why JP Morgan has accumulated 800 million ounces and done so in a manner that screams that they should be reprimanded for manipulation of the silver market. And Ted Butler has done a great job of talking about that. But the CTFC has kind of turned a blind eye to this and said, nothing here, keep on moving. Yet it screams of manipulative practices. Maybe, just maybe, the U.S. government said, listen, we've exhausted our stockpile of silver many years ago. We have to go into the open market to buy silver, to make silver eagles, for God's sakes. Why don't we have JP Morgan suppress the price and accumulate the physical? We'll give them a free pass as it pertains to antitrust laws and violation of the market practices. They get to keep the profit. We get to keep the physical silver. It's hard to understand how they've been allowed to push the price around the way they have, be the largest short on the market, and accumulate the largest position of physical the world's ever seen. That is highly manipulative, and it's illegal. So the bottom line is that, yeah, I think silver is the buying opportunity of a generation, Sarah. I do. And I think it's because it is a commodity that we must have. And the U.S. government came out a few years ago and said they believed it would be the first element struck from the periodic table of elements. So, it's a deal that there's not a lot of it. The low-lying fruit has been picked already. So much of it is gone through industry. And you can see a concerted effort by the most sophisticated, well-informed traders on the globe to amass the largest physical position the world's ever seen at one time, very quietly. To me, that screams of where they ultimately think it's going. And I think it's truly the buying opportunity of a generation. Far better buy than gold.
Well, and it really does tell you that with the government turning a blind eye, maybe there is some kind of deal going on there. Maybe that's part of the reset. And that's maybe what you're saying too. It's
a very large ship that they're trying to navigate and turn around. And, a speedboat turns quickly. An ocean liner doesn't. And that's right. You do it little by little by little. And you're right. And a lot of people think that is part of the reset. And that is part of the big game plan, is accumulating all of the world's commodities at pennies on the dollar at subsidized prices. And And there are people who would tell you they've done the same thing with copper, with aluminum, with all of the base metals, with all the fossil fuels, that they're accumulating all of these things at pennies on the dollar at subsidized prices. And all they really need to do is drive down the paper prices of all of the world's commodities at the same time they goose the equity markets. And so people think that the road to retirement is only paved with mutual funds and stock certificates, ignoring all of the commodities which have violated moving averages and technical indicators, allowing the big banks to gobble up the physical stockpiles of it when no one's looking.
Well, and that's what China's doing.
Misdirection. It's misdirection. I talk about the book The Art of War a lot. And the book The Art of War is a book written in the 5th century by a Chinese military strategist named Sun Tzu. That book, which basically teaches you how to beat your opponent without throwing a punch, has been taught in every major business school in the United States for, I don't know, the last 100 years. It's taught, it's mandatory reading if you are in the CIA. It's mandatory reading at West Point. It's highly encouraged for all military officers. It's mandatory reading for all Japanese business executives. Bill Belichick, the best football coach in the NFL, reads it to formulate game plans. And I'll tell you what, misdirection is a very pervasive train of thought in business schools and law schools in the United States, and they teach you how to misdirect. In other words, don't trust your lying eyes, trust your gut a little bit. And I think right now, if you follow what your eyes tell you, you lose. You have to trust your gut, and that's kind of a lonely existence. But when you see what's happening, and when you look at the numbers and really think about it for a minute, see what the big players are doing, it's hard to draw any other conclusion, at least it is for me. And so I think the bottom line is big money has been misdirecting all of the equity markets too, but they've been misdirecting all markets to push people in one direction, which allows them to accumulate all of the world's commodities with no competition. And ultimately, I think that's the end game. When things reset, what does it matter that you own? It matters that you own real tangible items: gold, oil, copper, aluminum, steel. Everything that you would need to sustain and build an infrastructure is what you want to accumulate. And I think that's what they've been doing.
Well, how do people get hold of you? I know you guys are the best. You've been around give us a little brief overview of your company and how they can get. I
appreciate that, Sarah.
Yeah.
We've been around for, this next year will be 30 years. We've done over 6 billion in transactions. We've never had a customer complaint ever. And you can spend all afternoon on Google, you won't find one. And in any industry, that's something we're proud of, let alone a federally non-regulated industry. And the precious metals industry is somewhat like the Wild West. There is no oversight, except in my home state of Minnesota. Minnesota is the only state in America that regulates the precious metals business. And as such, we are beholden to the Commissioner of Commerce with a very large surety bond, background checks of all of our employees and principals, and compliance that no one else in America has to abide by. In fact, there might be one or two companies, national companies outside of Minnesota, that have registered with the state of Minnesota. In other words, almost all the online companies will just not do business in Minnesota because they'd have to be subservient to the same set of regulations we are. And it's somewhat onerous, but what it really means, on top of our reputation, which we're tremendously proud of, Sarah, state of Minnesota will guarantee that people don't get ripped off by buying precious metals from a Minnesota-based company because of the surety bond in place. It just makes it impossible. In the last 3 years, we've seen, a couple $100 million lost from the three biggest online companies as they have gone bankrupt and their owners and presidents put into prison. It's a real deal. Anyways, we can be reached at milesfranklin.com. That's our website. I can be reached at andy@milesfranklin.com. And my 800 number is 255-1129. We're all about earning trust. People are more than welcome to give us a call, and we would love to chat with all of your listeners. That's for sure.
Yeah, and you guys are the best. That's what I know, and it shows. Now, do you ever regret making the decision to stay in Minnesota? When I know it's what gives you that ethical edge over everybody else, but isn't it kind of a pain in the ass?
It's a huge pain. Minnesota does things in a difficult manner. Not only that, but also the way that they charge state sales tax on certain types of precious metals. They passed a law after many years of lobbying to remove the sales tax for Minnesota residents. And when they finally came back with the law, they said, fine, gold and silver rounds and bars of 999 fineness or better would not be charged sales tax to Minnesota residents. But they said the difference between a round and a coin, well, any of the government issued coins, which everyone wants, the Maple Leafs, the Eagles, the Buffaloes, those are taxable because they have a legal tender face value. And so in typical Minnesota fashion, they did things half-assed, and they passed a law that more or less excludes. You can't even sell American Eagles. A legal tender coin that our Treasury mints and is legal tender. In fact, an American Eagle is a $50 face value coin, sir. If you took it to McDonald's by law, they'd have to take it. You wouldn't be very smart in doing so, but it's $50 or it's an ounce of gold. Well, the state of Minnesota, their rationale was that, well, someone could go into a bank with a gold eagle and turn it in for $50. So, they call that a taxable event. And our argument back to them is, well, no one will ever do that. They said, too bad. So yes, the state of Minnesota certainly has made it challenging, but as it pertains to doing business in this industry, it really does make it's a pain in the ass if you own a company, but it's really much safer for the consumer. The biggest company in the industry 3 years ago was Tulving. They did $600 million a year in sales, and they stole everything. And $55 million was lost. People will never receive that back, and Hannes Tulving is in prison. The same thing happened the next year with Bullion Direct out of Austin, Texas. Cheaper than everybody. Tons of business. $50 million stolen. The owner's in prison. And then last year, Ross Hansen, Northwest Territorial Mint, one of the very largest companies in America, always one of the cheapest online companies. He's in prison. They've been running a 7-year Ponzi scheme. The state of Minnesota basically said we're going to eliminate that risk. And it's a federally non-regulated industry. It's the Wild West. So yes, it's a pain in the ass, but it does allow me to stand on a podium and say, hey, reputation aside, the state of Minnesota will make sure that this transaction goes the way you'd want it to.
And so that's why it's safe to say that you're the best because of that, which is wonderful. So I get to say that.
You know what? I appreciate that. And the fact that we've never had a customer complaint ever in a world where, people complain for just about anything is something we take very seriously. We realize that people make mistakes in business, but it's how you react to it and fix it and make it right that matters. And we're good at that.
Okay. Again, what's your website?
MilesFranklin.com, Andy at MilesFranklin.com, or 800-255-1129, Sarah. That's to me directly.
Will you stay for 5 minutes for my patrons?
Absolutely.